Well, I am excited to be here with you on this particular topic. I know in the past uh, that there'd been the kind of hope that we might have a chance to talk about Druidry, but in the middle of the pandemic, it seemed like there were so many other things that really needed to be attended to, and so many other things that we had to pay mind to. So instead, we've held off, but here's the day. And what I want to do is actually start a little bit with going back to that childhood idea. Because for me, what became Druidry really started with other things first. And I wouldn't have known to call it that had I, at the time, when I was a little kid. I grew up Missouri Synod Lutheran, a pretty conservative form of Lutheranism. But my parents basically said that there were just a few things that we really needed to know. And one of the big ones was God is love. And the second one was God doesn't throw anyone away, and neither do we. And so even though Lutheranism was the thing that we did when we went to church, what we practiced at home was really about love and about inclusion. And so I took that God doesn't throw anyone away, and neither did we, and I made it about weeds as well. Everything had a place for me. Everything belonged somewhere. Everyone, no matter what kind of one it was, whether it was a plant or a person, an animal, an insect, anything at all, even rocks. My parents used to take us rock hunting, agate hunting, and fossil hunting when I was a little kid. And I even wanted to give them homes too. Their homes were probably better off in the earth in many ways, but instead, some of them came home to live with me. There's something about that childhood feeling that everything belongs, that everything needs a place, and that we don't throw anything or anyone away, that set the stage for my entire life. I also remember a song that we used to sing in church, and it wasn't a particularly Christian song, even though it was a Christian church. And I know there are people who would disagree with me about this one. But when I listened to the words recently, I went to a concert and somebody sang this in a really beautiful operatic style. And I'd never heard it like that before. But as I was listening, I realized that the song wasn't really Christian in particular. It was just about everything, the entire world. And the song, you might know it, was called He's Got the Whole World in His Hands. It was a great song for all of us little kids to sing in our Sunday school classes. And if I had remembered it without hearing it again, I might have remembered lines like, He's got you and me, brother, and He's got you and me, sister. And I might have remembered He's got the itty bitty little baby in His hands. But the words that I didn't remember as well, and then went back and went, yep, no, that's what we used to sing, were He's got the wind and the rain. He's got the sun and the moon, the birds and the bees, the beasts of the earth. And I don't remember Jesus being mentioned once. It would have been fine if he had been, but this particular song wasn't about that. This particular song was another place where, as a kid, I got to hear that everything belonged. Everything. And at some point, I know I asked my mother and I said, why is God he? Can you explain this to me? Because the way we talk about God in every other way, I don't understand why it's he. And she said, well, people use different kinds of language to explain different things. And that's the language that got attached. But God isn't a he or a she. God is just God. Okay, so it's just the song. Okay, and I set that down. But the part that stuck with me was this idea that the wind and the rain and the sun and the moon, the birds and the bees, all the beasts of the earth, as well as every person, was part of what was being held in love and in care. So now that we've had a little bit of time to hold on to those childhood memories, I would love to hear from just a couple of you. The sermon's going to have 3 more parts that we're going to talk about some different things and leave hopefully a little room for some questions and answers if need be. So there's probably not a lot of time for everybody to answer, but I would love to hear from just a couple of you. What was your childhood memory? What was the thing that helped you to love the earth? And if you don't get to jump in this time, there will be other opportunities with other questions relatively soon.
It's the birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees. You forgot a line. And I remember that song too. And I just remember working in my grandmother's garden and the wonderful fruits. So,
Yeah.
My family has a wonderful pond, and I started swimming in it when I was 3 years old. And I spent many, many, many hours underneath the water with the fish and looking up at the sky, and fell in love with the earth in that way.
when I was a kid, there was a woods between our house and our neighbor's house, the people we played with all the time. And we built a park we called Wonderland Park, a log across a tree. We cleared paths, and when we had it all done, we took our parents on a tour of it, and we thought it was beautiful, the most wonderful thing. I don't even remember now what it looked like, but to us, it was really a Wonderland Park.
Fantastic. I love these memories. Thank you. Some of them sound so familiar to me. We had a creek right near the house that I used to go and play in. Couldn't quite swim in it. And I see online, Frank says, climbing my front yard tree to read Lord of the Rings. And I actually did something very similar. There is something about that experience of essentially making friends with the landscape and with everything that lives in it that is transformative. Living on a little plot of land somewhere where there are fruits and vegetables that are just available and delightful. That was a part of my growing up too, and it made a huge difference in terms of how I saw the earth to be a safe and welcoming and wonderful place. So as I grew up, I went on to do some more things. I found myself really fascinated by science and biology in particular. I suppose that shouldn't surprise anybody given everything else. But there was something about wanting to know, how does it all grow? How does it all work? How does it live together? How does this amazing planet have all of these different things that live in so many different ways and yet live together? And why do they go where they go, do what they do? At first, I thought I was going to be a marine biologist, and I suspect that there were a lot of kids about my age at that time in the 1970s and 80s who thought marine biology is the thing. There was Jacques Cousteau, of course. There were all sorts of beautiful television programs where we got to see underwater and see animals that we might never have found otherwise. I was particularly fascinated by dolphins and coral reefs and the really weird looking deep sea fish. But I was also really fascinated by the things that were part of my everyday life, the things that were around me all the time. And so I did a lot of study when I was in school. I went to the Shedd Aquarium in Chicago and watched the fish there. And I went to the zoos and I went to the botanical gardens. I got to spend a lot of time just being and observing. And then in classes, I learned about how it all worked. I learned about the Krebs cycle and about photosynthesis. And I learned about ecology and the wind and the rain and the birds and the bees and how all of it kind of played together to make a life that is possible for us all. I learned about how plants take in carbon dioxide and make oxygen, and how that eventually all that energy can turn into fruit. I learned about how different animals eat other different animals, and even though it's not always fun to watch on nature programs on television, how important it is, because everything that lives needs to consume something else to continue to live. When I was in high school, I took biology twice. I took basic biology, and then I took, I think it was just called AP biology in my high school. But it was essentially a field sort of class. We went outside and studied plots of land, counted different creatures, insects, animals, plants, funguses. And then I went on to college and I dug even deeper into all of that. And I became a neurobiologist and behaviorist. I also studied ecology. And there was something about the logic of science, the knowing of the earth, that made an enormous difference in my life. It was wonderful to be friends with it, to be out in it, to enjoy it, to encourage it. But it was also something else then to understand it, to know how these things worked together, to know something about what everything was named, to learn the names of trees and wildflowers, different kinds of stones, the things that I would find if I was walking around out in the world around me. And this, by knowing all of that, by naming the world around me, I got to know it in a new and different and deeper way. And that too was really special for me. And it was another way that I learned to love the earth, because I learned to love it for how it worked and how I was part of that, to know what I could do that made it better or perhaps worse. And then as I went along well after college, I took a course called a permaculture design course, where I got to learn how I could plant gardens in ways that mimicked ecology, so that things that would grow together well would support one another, and I could plant things exactly where they needed to be. And I've done some of that in my own garden ever since. So this brings me to my next question for you. How have you learned to know the earth in a way that helps you to love it? Are there things about science or perhaps gardening? Maybe there's something about bird watching, or maybe you track bears as they wander through your part of the world. Where I am, we actually are asked to make bear sighting notes. So the other day when I had a family of 5 bears playing on the mulch pile in my front garden, the mother bear was there with 2 cubs from 2 summers ago, and then this summer's cubs. And they were all playing King of the Mountain on the mulch pile. It was perhaps the most delightful thing I've seen in a really long time. But it wasn't just about then knowing it. It was about saying to our wildlife authority, I suppose, in Connecticut, yes, here's the thing. We can tell you about what's happening. I can let you know that there's a family of 5 bears in my neighborhood and what they were doing. Being part of citizen science is something that helps me keep up that kind of knowing and naming, and helps me to love the earth. So are there things like that for you? I'm curious, maybe a couple of you have something that comes to mind right away where knowing the earth, naming it, is something that you can talk about. And if you're online, happy to hear from you as well, but I think we're going to start with the people in the room first.
Thanks. Good morning, all. So my wife Debbie and I live on a small lake, and one of the roles that I play for the lake is that I'm in charge of what we call the Lake Health Committee. Now, I did enjoy biology, but I did not go on to science because I hit physics, and that ended it for me. But in this role, I've learned all about the ecology of a shallow bottom lake. And part of my role is to then put together education materials so that others can learn about how a lake, goes through eutrophication and evolves as a living body. And that's all brand new knowledge for me about nature.
When I took ecology in college, it was actually one of my weakest biology subjects. I loved biology, but I did really poorly on tree identification. I grew up in New York City, and I knew basically one tree, the oak. So every tree was to be oak tree. And in college in New Hampshire, there was a lot of variety in the forest, and I felt really intimidated by everybody who could recognize like trees, and just by looking at the bark. And I was like, oh wow, you're all so impressive. But today, what I do is, it's still one of my weaknesses. I have an app called PlantNet. So when I see a plant, I just take its picture, and thanks to technology, I instantly get a recognition of what the plant is. So now I'm like, oh, that's what you are. So, but that's how I go about. I married technology with nature, so now I can learn what identify what's around me. Thank you.
Technology is a huge help. Not all of us can know everything all the time. So I am a big fan of the things that help us learn like that. Thank you. There is something really remarkable about what happens to our relationships with the natural world when we learn about how they work and what they are, with what their names are, so that we can walk by and say, oh yes, I recognize you, friend maple, friend oak. I definitely have particular trees in my yard that I've gotten to know because they're the ones that I see every day. But learning different kinds of trees, that's something that I have enjoyed a lot. And it takes time. And I love that there's technology that can help make that happen too. Learning something about how entire systems work, like a shallow bottom lake, or like an agricultural system, or even an urban forest. There's something about knowing how things work in the place that you are helps you to be more connected in that space, to know your place, to know your set of relationships in it. So I would say that I flirted with Druidry, I suppose is one way of saying it. When I was in college, I started practicing earth-centered religions, and I was pretty eclectic, pretty loose about it. I wasn't really a Wiccan. I wasn't really a witch or anything else. I was just kind of like what I often said was kind of eclectic, generic pagan. I looked at the world and said, this place makes so much sense to me and is so important to me that I want to put my time and energy into appreciating it for what it is, rather than worrying about how it might all work beyond that. And so the idea of like an overwhelming God, or that kind of thing that is far beyond us all, wasn't something that I spent a lot of time thinking about anymore, because I was much more interested and invested in the relationships that I was having with what was immediately around me, the people and the plants and the animals and the land and the waters. So I liked the word druid. I liked the idea of it, but it wasn't something that really that I really clung to or really attached myself to at first. I knew other people identified themselves that way, but I didn't quite have that sense of like, oh, I can claim this for myself. And so I went on thinking about how I could do sustainable things, planting gardens and having compost, enjoying being out in the woods and supporting land trusts, all those sorts of good things. And then I became a Unitarian Universalist minister and discovered that we had cups, the covenant of UU pagans, and that we had this seventh principle that invited us into really being in relationship with the interconnected web, right? And that helped me feel like Unitarian Universalism was a place that I could belong. And it didn't take long then for me to get on the path to ministry. So at one point I served on the board of CUPS, the national organization. I helped congregations think about green sanctuary work. My congregation right now is doing that process. I thought about all the different ways in which our faith said that it was as important to pay attention to the earth as it was to pay attention to the idea of democracy or the idea of inclusivity or dignity, that it was its own actual principle that had the need for us to pay attention to it. And that made me feel like this was a great place to be. So I'm going to hold, truthfully, I would love to hear all of your, how did I come to Unitarian Universalism and how does it help connect me with the earth sorts of stories. But I'm going to fast forward just a little bit into Druidry so that we spend some time with that and that you can ask any questions that you might have about it. So while I was a Unitarian Universalist minister, I realized that I also needed something that could speak to my own spiritual needs. So it's great to be a UU. It was great to do the work outside in the church and beyond, but I needed something that was just for me. And so as I thought about what might work, I knew that other Unitarian Universalists had a Buddhist practice that was just for them, or maintained some aspect of their Christianity that they had grown up with, or Judaism that they'd grown up with. Everybody had something that was UU, and then a little bit of spiritual practice that kind of connected with their way of seeing the world. And so I needed something like that too. And so I started looking at Druidry. And I noticed that there were a lot of different kinds of Druidry. There was a group called ADF, or Arnriocht Féin, which means our own Druidry. And it is a contemporary creation. It draws on old Celtic and Irish and other ideas, but doesn't use them exactly as the ancient Celts did. Instead, it is this kind of recent creation that imagines the world in a earth-centered, but also relationships with those things that are not easily seen or named, with perhaps spirits or gods, but it has its own kind of flavor. And that didn't really seem to fit for me. I looked at something called the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, or OBOD, which is an organization that came out of England, out of the British Isles, I should say. And they have a very British Isles centered way of looking at the world, which is great. And I enjoyed that, but it didn't make entire sense to me because I lived at the time in the Midwest of the United States. And so not everything matched up just the same way. We didn't have all the same trees, for example. So then I found something called the AODA, the Ancient Order of Druids in America. And I was like, well, this is kind of interesting. They're asking people to pay attention to the place where they live and make relationships with the world that they live in, with the trees and the plants, with the land, the animals, the birds, the insects, the fishes in the waters, the amphibians, the lizards, all of it, right where you are. I thought, okay, well, that makes some sense to me. That feels pretty good. And then I started digging a little bit deeper, and I discovered that they were connected to something called revival Druidry, which is something that happened largely in the British Isles in the 1800s, where people kind of imagined back to a romanticized, idealized past, saying, you know, hey, Druidry had something wonderful in it, and this is a way for us to connect with the natural world. And what they came up with wasn't really the same as what had been before. There's no unbroken line of Druidic knowledge and practice from the ancient times through the revival period or now. But they were able to kind of think about and imagine a way of having their own Druidry, and that has continued since. And so that's the group that I became a part of. And as I did, I discovered something really interesting. They're a lot like Unitarian Universalists. There's something really funny about this. I seem to have a certain kind of way that I want the world to work. I like a world that is pluralistic. I like a way for us to all exist in all of our different ideas. And so just like in Unitarian Universalism, some of us are humanists and some of us are Christian or Jewish or pagan or Buddhist Taoist, Confucian, what have you, all sorts of different things. There are also, in my order, there are Druids who are Christians and Jews and Buddhists and humanists. There are Druids who are purely scientifically minded and some who are very animistic, who believe that there's a spirit in everything. There are definitely pagan Druids, lots of people who connect to the ideas that we find in mythology or just in the earth itself. Some people are really grounded in science, and some people are really grounded in ecology, and some people are really grounded in some sort of mysticism or magical system. And we all participate in the same community comfortably together. And in that way, it really is an awful lot like Unitarian Universalism, just a slightly different format in terms of how people get together and a little bit different focus. The Druids tend to be much more focused on a person's relationship with the natural world. And in Unitarian Universalism, that's part of what we do, but we're also really interested in our relationships with one another, in how we think about making justice for other human beings. And now, of course, thinking about environmental justice and how we make justice for the earth too. So slightly different ways of doing things, but some really, really similar ideas. Now, I know that Karen Fisher has been part of your congregation for a while and talked about this too. And so you've heard some of these ideas before, I'm sure. But I come to it from the place of saying, what is religion? What is spirituality? How does this all work? And when I think about those sorts of things, and I think about being a UU, and I think about being a Druid, what I find for me is that I need spaces that are about understanding the real relationship that I have with the world as it is. It's not about having somebody else tell me, this is what it has to be like. You have to agree to this or you can't be a part of who we are. But rather, both of these systems ask me to come to, what is it that I think? What is it that I experience? What are my relationships with the things beyond myself? And if I can find those, then I will know my place within Unitarian Universalism and within my Druidry. I'm going to stop here because that's been an awful lot. And I'm curious about what questions you might have. Are there things that you want to know about any kind of Druidry in particular? Maybe a little bit more about where it comes from, how we practice. What would be helpful for you to know?
Do you have rituals that are different from the pagan rituals that the Cups group does?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, the Cups kind of invents its rituals. Every group does things a little bit differently. Often they're tied to the equinoxes, for example, or to traditional festival times that come often out of the British Isles framework. Druidry tends not to necessarily follow those things exactly, although depending on the group. So in ADF, Arnrecht Fein, some people follow a Celtic pantheon, but they can use other pantheons in that group. So they might use the Greek pantheon or a Norse pantheon. And so that might change some of what they do. But for the AODA in particular, there are a specific set of rituals that we ask everybody to learn so that if we come together, we all know how to participate in worship together. It's an awful lot like Unitarian Universalism. What does Sunday morning worship look like? Okay, it might be a little different from place to place, but often there's some words to get us started. Usually there's a hymn, maybe two, a time for all ages, a sermon. You might light a chalice and then have some closing words. The AODA rituals are sort of like that. There's a little bit more pageantry. There's vestments and different kinds of clothes to wear and different ways that people enter the space and leave the space. But basically, it's a structure for worship, for paying attention to the world. So yes, it's a little bit different than cups, but there are absolutely rituals. And if you were to be participating in one, it might feel a little different than what you're used to, but you'd recognize pretty quickly what was going on.
I'm wondering how religion is influenced by our environment and what we believe is rooted in what's happening in our world today.
This is a great question. And one of the ways that I can answer that is by inviting you to consider what we call the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. When I look at these three religions, I see them all coming out of a part of the world that we call them desert religions sometimes. They come out of a part of the world where there is often not enough water to go around, where resources are limited. There are some places where there is lots and lots of water, right? If you follow the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, or there are places in Palestine and Israel, there are places where there's plenty of water. Egypt along the Nile has these periods of flood and growth. So abundance is possible in these places, but these religions came into a time and place where people were competing for resources. And so when I look at the religions that have grown out of those, I see religions that are very concerned about, are we the right people? Do we get what we should have? Are we somehow privileged? Does God love us the most so that we can have the things that we need, knowing that there might not be enough for everybody? But in places where that isn't really the case, you don't have that same sort of tribalism, I guess. Maybe. You don't have that same kind of, we're the chosen people and we get what we get what we need and what we deserve, what we're going to fight for and what God is going to help provide for us. In other places where abundance was kind of the rule, people were like, oh yeah, those people are people, these people are people, everybody's people. We all kind of live in our own spaces. And in fact, plants are people and animals are people, and everybody occupies the space that they're supposed to be in. And we find ways to eat and to live and to die and to just be a part of this world. So I think that our environment actually influences our religion a lot. It influences our metaphors. It influences how we imagine the goodness of God or gods, how we imagine we are taken care of. I think that's a big part of why the earth-centered religions appealed to me so much more after hearing, when I was a kid, God is love and God doesn't throw anyone away and neither do we. Hearing that, I didn't really want to be a part of a religious framework that declared that there were winners and losers, that there were people who should have things and people who shouldn't. So I think our environment makes a huge difference.
So there's some online. So okay. So Margaret and Rob, do you want to unmute?
Yes. I just was wondering, is there a particular spiritual practice or meditation practice that you do in Druidry? And could you explain about that, please?
Absolutely. So there are a few different meditation type practices, but so very, very commonly what's taught as kind of what I might say is the gold standard of meditation in the world is mindfulness meditation, right? The sort of, you pay very close attention to exactly what you're doing and nothing else, or that you empty yourself. You try to just let thoughts blow across your mind if they show up at all, but otherwise you just try to be calm and peaceful. And in the AODA, we actually use a very different form of meditation as a primary way of practicing. And that's actually called discursive meditation. And it's where you don't let your thoughts blow past you, you actually engage them. So if you have a thought, you pay attention to that thought and where it leads you next and where it leads you next and next. But it's not about letting your brain just kind of go and race with everything. it's about having a particular idea and then thinking about, well, so where does that lead me? And where does that lead me? And what does that mean? And then if you find yourself starting to wonder about what you're going to make for dinner, you instead from there, you track backwards until you catch that train of your thought again. So discursive meditation is a way of paying close attention to the conversations that you are having inside of yourself all of the time, to kind of train your brain rather than to just let everything go, to be able to focus really clearly and carefully on a particular idea or a particular thought process and follow it through to the end. We also do understand that, times of observation and just kind of peaceful being in the world are great. And so I'm all in favor of that kind of, you're walking along and suddenly you discover this gorgeous little purple mushroom growing in a place you've never seen a beautiful little purple mushroom before. And then you sit down in the middle of the forest path and just sit and stare at it and enjoy its existence and, not do a lot of thinking. That's something that I certainly love doing. Observing and appreciating the very, very small is a personal spiritual practice for me. But the meditation that we really encourage people to try and to learn how to do is this discursive meditation, so that we have the counterbalance, right? The idea of the mindfulness meditation or the kind of emptiness meditations, those are useful, but it's also useful to actually know how your mind works and to be able to engage it deeply and precisely, rather than just kind of scattershot and getting lost in everything. I hope that answered your question. Great.
There's a great deal of emphasis on one's relationship with the natural world. So would individuals, as someone who also lived in, cities for many years, would individuals in urban environments who have a very different level of exposure and engagement with the natural world, would they have difficulty finding a home in Druidry? Would they find the images that one calls up, for example, for peace and reassurance and comfort, would they feel even possibly alienated from that's a world so beyond their own, that there are different ways that they engage with the world outside of the walls of their apartment, for example?
It's a great question. And so what I would say is that different Druid groups would handle that differently. There may well be Druid groups where urban Druids would struggle to make sense out of the mythology or the spiritual practices of that group. But in the AODA, because our emphasis is so deeply on find the nature that you actually live in where you are and connect with that, we have lots of urban Druids, actually. And they talk about their experiences perhaps a little bit differently. So whereas I might talk about finding that little purple mushroom that's growing under in the woods on the side of the path, somebody else might say, oh, there is nothing I love so much as the chicory that grows up along the sidewalks, right? It's a plant that is beautiful with its flowers, and it is insistent and determined to grow in inhospitable places. I know people who are very attached to their local parks, to their urban forests, to the streets, to the trees planted along the streets, or the little garden plots that they come across each day. I know people who attach particularly to a love for the pigeons or the peregrine falcons that live on skyscrapers. So I think it depends on the group, but in my experience, we actually have plenty of urban Druids in the Ancient Order of Druids in America. And we actually had an entire journal, if I remember correctly, that was dedicated to paying attention to urban Druidry and what did that mean? How does that work? So we encourage people to engage that way and to think about it. And because So the language that we use is wild crafting your Druidry, looking at the place where you are. What is wild? What is the environment that you're in? And how do you make that your metaphor, your framework for understanding your engagement with the natural world? Even if it's a city, the truth is cities are natural because they were built by human beings and we are natural things. So if you think about a city, kind of like an anthill, right? It's not that different from an anthill or a termite mound. It is constructed by the beings that live there in order to support the kind of life that they want. And that means that even if there is asphalt and plastic, it's still drawn completely from the natural world in our own minds, which are inherently part of that natural world too.
I was just wondering, so I grew up in Brooklyn and and it was difficult, but I think, just a side note, like there's the botanical gardens in Brooklyn and I would just get lost there as a child. Like I'd forget exactly where I even was. I had a favorite tree in our park. But I was wondering for you, like, do you have, I've said like history books, but like, where are you with like, gods, deities? Like, is there something that your denomination, I guess, I don't know what the right word is there, that, really follow through? I'd like to hear a little bit about it.
Yeah. So with the AODA in particular, some people have an attachment to the idea of deities and other people don't connect with that at all. Some people are more animist, believing that there is a spirit in everything. And I can totally get on board with that. That makes sense to me. There isn't anything that's super consistent. There is kind of a legend or a mythology framework that is part of the AODA that comes out of revival Druidry. It's not particularly ancient, but so there are kind of gods who are named as relevant to certain types of nature. And to be honest, most of them don't stick with me because they're not part of a pantheons that I remember reading about as a kid. They're not things that I connect to. But there is something like that that's kind of historical. But in today's practice, it's much, much broader than that. And so there's no one way that people think about it, exactly the same as with Unitarian Universalism. There are just lots and lots of different ways that people envision how the universe works beyond them.
If someone wanted to learn more, if they're a basic beginner, where would you recommend they start to learn about Druidism?
Talk to Karen Fisher. She's kind of your local in-house expert. But aside from that, to learn about the particular group that Karen and I are a part of, you would just go to aoda.org. But most of these organizations have web presences now. So Arnriocht Féin, ADF, has a website. The OBOD has a website. So you can simply Google that. I'm guessing that there's probably a couple of good kind of, what is Druidry, sort of like big overview sorts of options. But I would say if you even just started with those three, I think it's like adf.org, obod.org, and aoda.org or something like that. You'd get a pretty good sense of what it all looks like. I see we should wrap up. I was just about to say myself, I think we're probably coming close to the end of our time. So I hope that gives you some idea of what Druidry is, but also how one comes to it. Like, how did I get there? And how did I get there while also being a Unitarian Universalist? I think most of us figure out how to love the earth from multiple layers and places, multiple different ways of getting there. So wherever you are in this process, wherever you are in gaining knowledge and building a relationship with the earth is fantastic. And if Druidry happens to be something that's appealing to you, by all means, look it up, send questions. I certainly don't mind answering questions. If you want to gather some up and send them to me, I'd be happy to answer them for you too.
Thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
We'll now have a moment of silent reflection. Our closing hymn is number 1064, Blue Boat Home. Please join me in the closing words. In things essential, unity. In things circumstantial, liberty. In things yet to be, courage. And in all things, wisdom and love.
Sometimes I wonder why I spend such lonely nights. Oh, baby, lonely nights. Dreaming of a song that melody haunts my memory. And I am once again with you. When our love was new. Each kiss an inspiration. Now that maybe you know was long ago. My heart is will be vain. My stardust melody, oh melody, oh melody.
Thank you to everyone who made this service possible. Thank you, Reverend Rubbersmith. I just love hearing about I'll try a metaphor here, the many interesting strands that make up the wonderful tapestry of the UU community. So, and Aaron, it's so great to have you here playing. And my wife, Sue, who dragged us here early, and I think everything mostly kind of worked. Yeah. And Rick is the greeter, and me, of course, the most important. That's right. So, spirituality is not a spectator sport. As Unitarian Universalists, using your voice is vital to our success as a whole. Use your voice today to fill out the worship committee survey. Speaking of using our voice, We will now have our social action minute from the Social Action Committee. All right. I hope it wasn't me. I think I'm next week.
It could be, doesn't matter, but Aaron, that's terrific. That's really sweet. Our fifth principle is the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process in our congregations and in society at large. And in that spirit, many of us believe that democracy is preserved by voting, speaking our mind and advocating what we care about, and at some point in your life, becoming a public policy maker by either being appointed or elected. We do not endorse candidates, but we encourage candidates to come here and express themselves. This morning, Fern Lurd, who is a candidate for the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, District 120. Representative Aaron Coffer is the current incumbent and also on the ticket. And so I encourage you to meet with Fern after the service and hear her thoughts and how you might connect with her campaign. Thank you.
Right. We will now have our congregational announcements. So I'm only going to do a week's worth instead of, because we have many, many pages. It's all in the announcements that we send out in email. And in those you can find much, much more. So next Saturday, October 22nd at 4 p.m., we're having a special farewell potluck for Rick Williams and Linda Casey. We're both sad and it's excited because you're starting a really cool new part. So once you get tired of Seattle, then there's a sign up sheet in the back for the potluck. And it's being held at Beth's Pond, and there's directions in the announcements thingy. Next Sunday, we're having a community, not 2 Sundays from now. We're having, I'm breaking my rule. I want to go 2 Sundays ahead because we're having a trunk or treat after the service here. So, and there's more information in there. Soul Matters today's the 16th. Today, Soul Matters after the service here, sanctuary, or in this building. Next Wednesday, the 19th, we're having our board meeting. Everyone's it's on via Zoom. Everyone's welcome to attend. Again, the meeting link will be in the announcements. Thursday, there is an online event from Zoom about those named and unnamed death, work, and ancestral practice. So I assume that's a CUPS thing. Again, there's much more information about that. And next Friday, there's the Wyoming Valley CUPS monthly planning meeting online via Zoom at 7 p.m. And next Saturday, the Northern Chalice Circle Soul Matters group meets at Jill's house at 1. And then that takes us well past next Sunday. So again, all of this stuff with much more information is in our actual announcement notes. So that concludes today's service. Thank you for attending and see you next Sunday. And there's some treats in the back. I can see like 3 different treats in the back. And people online aren't allowed to have any of the treats because that's, you know, but we'll leave the Zoom call up so people online can chat if they'd like. We good.
I just